She hid 89 Hell's Angels from a tornado. Days later, 299 bikers returned to change her life. The afternoon sky darkened as Eleanor kneaded her bread dough with practiced hands. Through the kitchen window, she watched gray clouds gather and swirl, painting the sky an ominous shade. The weather report had mentioned possible storms, but this looked more serious than she'd expected. "My goodness," she whispered to herself, patting flour from her hands. The wind outside had picked up, bending the old oak trees in her front yard at alarming angles. Eleanor had lived in this farmhouse for over 50 years, weathering countless Midwest storms. She knew the signs of trouble brewing. The radio on her countertop crackled with static before the emergency broadcast system cut through. Tornado warning for the following counties. Her county was among those listed. Eleanor crossed to the window again, her arthritic hands gripping the windowsill as she peered out. The wind was howling now, whistling through the cracks in her old farmhouse. Leaves and small branches tumbled across her yard. "I should get to the cellar," she murmured. But something caught her attention. A low rumble, different from thunder, approached her property. Eleanor squinted through the glass, wiping away condensation with the corner of her apron. What she saw made her breath catch. Before you continue listening, please let me know where in the world are you watching from today. Now back to the Story motorcycles. Dozens of them. They roared up her long gravel driveway, a stream of chrome and leather. Men hunched over their handlebars. They were fighting the increasingly violent gusts. Eleanor counted 20, 40, more than 60 as they poured onto her property. Their black leather jackets bore patches she recognized from news reports. Hell's Angels. "Lord have mercy," she whispered, her heart pounding. The sky had turned an eerie greenish black. The wind screamed around the corners of her house, and the first heavy raindrops began to splash against the windows. Eleanor watched as the bikers parked their motorcycles hurriedly, some of them pointing at the sky behind them. She followed their gestures and felt her blood run cold. In the distance, a funnel cloud was forming, its violent rotation clearly visible even from here. The tornado was coming straight toward them, the bikers huddled together shouting over the wind. One man, big taller than the others with a salt and pepper beard, seemed to be giving directions. He pointed toward Eleanor's farmhouse, and her stomach tightened. "What should I do?" she asked herself, backing away from the window. Part of her wanted to lock the doors and hide in the cellar. These were Hell's Angels, roughnecks, troublemakers according to everything she'd heard. Nearly 90 strange men on her property during a tornado. What would they do to an old woman alone? But another voice spoke in her heart. These were people in danger. The tornado was bearing down on them all. Her farmhouse was solid, built by her late husband with a proper storm cellar underneath. It had weathered storms for half a century. The bread dough sat forgotten on the counter as Eleanor stood frozen in indecision. A particularly violent gust rattled the windows, and she heard a crash from outside. One of the motorcycles had blown over. Her doorbell rang, followed by urgent knocking. Eleanor took a deep breath, straightened her apron, and walked to the front door. The wind nearly yanked it from her hands as she pulled it open just wide enough to see who was there. The tall man with the salt and pepper beard stood on her porch, rain dripping from his leather jacket. Up close, she could see the patches on his vest more clearly. Hell's Angels, just as she'd thought. Behind him, dozens of bikers huddled together, looking anxiously at the approaching funnel cloud. "Ma'am," he shouted over the wind, "I'm Mark. We need shelter. There's a tornado coming. Can we please come inside?" Eleanor hesitated for just a moment, her hand trembling on the door. And then she looked into Mark's eyes and saw something there beyond the tough exterior, genuine fear and concern for his people. She took a deep breath, said a silent prayer, and nodded. "Come in," Eleanor said, pulling the door open wider. "All of you, hurry!" Eleanor stepped back, holding the door wide as the bikers filed into her home. They came in a rush, bringing with them the smell of rain, leather, and motor oil. Some nodded politely as they passed her, while others kept their eyes down, shoulders hunched against the storm. "The living room can hold most of you," Eleanor said, pointing toward the large space with its worn but comfortable furniture. "Some can stay in the kitchen. If the tornado gets too close, we'll all head down to the cellar." Mark, the tall biker with the salt and pepper beard, directed his people with hand gestures. They moved with surprising order, 89 men and women in leather finding spaces in Eleanor's modest farmhouse. "Thank you, ma'am," Mark said, removing his wet bandana. "We saw the funnel forming and knew we couldn't outrun it. Your place was the only shelter for miles." Eleanor smiled, her initial fear fading as she looked at their weary, rain-soaked faces. "No one should be caught outside in weather like this. I'm Eleanor, by the way." A crash of thunder shook the house, making several bikers jump. Through the windows, the sky had turned an unnatural greenish black. The wind howled around the eaves, a high-pitched scream that sent shivers down Eleanor's spine. "Sounds like it's getting worse," she said, more to herself than to her unexpected guests. "I was just about to bake some bread when you all arrived. Might as well finish it. We could be here a while." Eleanor made her way back to the kitchen, where a group of bikers stood awkwardly, trying not to drip on her clean floor. A woman with short blonde hair and tattoos covering both arms offered her help. "I'm Lisa," she said. "Let me give you a hand. My grandma taught me to bake." Eleanor accepted gratefully, and soon they were working side by side, shaping the dough into loaves while the storm raged outside. More bikers drifted toward the kitchen, drawn by the homey smell of yeast and flour. "How many loaves are you making?" asked a burly man with a thick beard. "Well," Eleanor said, glancing around at all the people filling her house, "I think we'll need more than I planned. There's more flour in that pantry, if someone wouldn't mind getting it." Several bikers jumped to help. Eleanor found herself giving directions, showing them where to find bowls and baking sheets. The simple task seemed to calm everyone, providing a welcome distraction from the worsening storm. The wind's fury increased by the minute. Objects struck the sides of the house, branches torn from trees, debris caught in the violent gusts. The lights flickered once, twice, then steadied. "Got a generator?" Mark asked, helping Eleanor slide the first batch of bread into the oven. "Yes, my husband installed it before he passed. It should kick in automatically if we lose power." As if on cue, the lights went out. For a moment, darkness filled the house, punctuated by nervous laughter from the bikers. Then the generator hummed to life, and the lights returned, and slightly dimmer than before. "Your husband thought of everything," Mark said approvingly. "Richard was always prepared," Eleanor replied, a hint of sadness in her voice. "He's been gone 15 years now, but his handiwork still keeps me safe." Outside, the roar grew louder, a sound like a freight train approaching. Eleanor had heard it before, the unmistakable voice of a tornado. Some of the younger bikers looked toward the windows with alarm. "It's coming closer," Lisa whispered. "We'll be fine," Eleanor assured her. "This old house has weathered worse." The first loaves of bread came out of the oven, golden and fragrant. Eleanor set them on the counter to cool, while more dough rose in bowls around the kitchen. Despite the storm's fury, a sense of warmth filled the room. "Everyone grab a seat if you can find one," Eleanor called out. "Bread will be ready soon." The bikers gathered around her kitchen table and spilled into adjacent spaces. Some sat on the floor, Others leaned against walls. Mark helped Eleanor slice the bread and pass it around on plates she hadn't used since her last family gathering years ago. "Nothing better than fresh bread during a storm," one of the bikers said, closing his eyes as he took a bite. Eleanor smiled, watching these strangers, these Hell's Angels with their tough exteriors, savor something as simple as homemade bread in her kitchen. The contrast touched her heart. "So," she said, taking a seat at the head of the table, "what brings 89 Hell's Angels to this part of the country?" The storm's roar intensified outside, but inside, when surrounded by the warmth of fresh bread and new company, it seemed less threatening. Mark leaned forward, and the others grew quiet, ready to share their story as the tornado raged. The house shuddered as if struck by a giant fist. Pictures rattled on the walls, and a vase toppled from a shelf, shattering on the hardwood floor. The sound of the tornado was deafening now, a constant, hungry roar that seemed to swallow all other noises. "Is it supposed to shake like that?" Lisa asked, her fingers gripping the edge of the kitchen table. Eleanor nodded calmly. "That's normal. The pressure changes when a tornado gets close. Makes the whole house feel like it's breathing." Another violent tremor rocked the farmhouse. A few of the bikers exchanged worried glances. One young man with a skull tattooed on his forearm kept looking up at the ceiling, as if expecting it to cave in at any moment. "My daddy built this house in 1956, Eleanor said, her voice steady and reassuring. "Used oak beams thicker than your arm. We've made it through worse storms than this one." Mark ran a hand through his beard. "You hear about twisters picking up whole houses, tossing them like toys." "Those are the stories people tell," Eleanor replied, standing up to check on more bread in the oven. "And yes, it happens, but not as often as you'd think. Most houses stay put, even in bad storms." The windows rattled again, as a particularly strong gust struck the side of the house. Outside, the world had gone dark at mid-afternoon, the sky a churning mass of green-black clouds. A crash from the front yard made several bikers jump. Through the window, they could see Eleanor's old oak tree had lost a massive branch. "That was bound to happen sooner or later," Eleanor said with a sigh. "That branch has been hanging by a thread since last winter." She pulled another golden brown loaf from the oven, seemingly unbothered by the destruction outside. Her calmness had a strange effect on the room. The bikers, men and women who faced danger regularly on the road, found themselves taking cues from this 80-year-old woman who treated a tornado like an inconvenient rainstorm. "Who wants some stew to go with the bread?" Eleanor asked, already moving toward her pantry. "Worse, I canned it last fall, beef with potatoes and carrots." "Let me help you with that," offered a biker with a full sleeve of tattoos and a gentle voice that surprised Eleanor. He followed her to the pantry, carefully carrying out jars of stew while she directed him to the right pot. Soon the kitchen filled with the rich aroma of heating stew, mingling with the yeasty smell of fresh bread. The combination seemed to lift everyone's spirits despite the storm's continued assault. "You're awful prepared, ma'am," Mark commented, as Eleanor efficiently fed her unexpected guests. Eleanor smiled. "When you live alone in the country, you learn to keep a well-stocked pantry. Never know when you might be stuck for days, or when 89 hungry bikers might show up at your door." This brought laughter from around the room, uneasing the tension as another wave of wind buffeted the house. "Dig in, everyone," Eleanor encouraged, passing bowls around the crowded kitchen. "Food always tastes better during a storm." The bikers ate gratefully, some closing their eyes in appreciation. For many, it had been years since they'd tasted home-cooked food prepared with such care. "This reminds me of my grandmother's cooking," said a woman with silver rings in her eyebrow. "She used to make bread just like this." Others nodded, sharing brief memories of family meals and comfort foods from their pasts. Eleanor listened, asking questions and learning about the lives behind the leather vests and tattoos. Outside, the wind's howl began to change pitch. The constant pressure against the house eased slightly, and the darkness lightened a shade or two. I think it's moving past us, Eleanor said, pausing to listen. The worst is probably over. Mark moved to the window, peering out at the ravaged yard. Wind's still strong, but you're right. It doesn't sound the same. Over the next half hour, the storm's fury gradually subsided. The roaring faded to a persistent moan, then to gusting winds that seemed ordinary compared to what had come before. Rain continued to fall heavily, but the terrifying presence of the tornado had moved on. Bikers began to venture towards the windows, watching as the sky lightened from black to gray. Outside, branches and debris littered Eleanor's yard. A section of her fence was down, and the old barn's door hung at an angle, but the house had survived intact. You all can stay until it's safe to leave, Eleanor said, gathering empty bowls. No sense rushing out into that mess. The bikers looked at each other, then back at the diminutive woman who had sheltered them without hesitation. The storm had forced them together, strangers from entirely different worlds, and in those frightening hours, something unexpected had happened. A connection had formed, tenuous but real. Thank you, Mark said simply, his weathered face serious as he looked at Eleanor. The others murmured agreement, their expressions softened by gratitude and the shared experience of weathering the storm together. Sunlight broke through the clouds, casting golden beams across Eleanor's yard. The storm had left its mark. Scattered branches, toppled garden furniture, and mud splashed across the walkway. But the worst had passed. Eleanor stood on her porch, and watching as the bikers began to check their motorcycles for damage. Most had escaped with just water spots and mud splatters. A few needed minor repairs where flying debris had struck them. Your bike okay? Eleanor asked Mark as he inspected his Harley. Just some scratches. He ran his hand along the leather seat, wiping away water droplets. Nothing serious. We got lucky. Eleanor nodded, pulling her cardigan tighter around her shoulders. The air felt fresh after the storm, washed clean by the rain. Birds had already returned to the trees that remained standing, their cheerful songs a stark contrast to the tornado's roar. Inside the house, bikers were collecting their jackets and helmets. Some had helped Eleanor straighten furniture that had shifted during the storm. Others swept up broken glass from the fallen vase. "Joe, you don't need to do that," Eleanor protested when she saw a young woman with purple-streaked hair mopping up water that had leaked through a window. "It's the least we can do," the woman replied. "You saved our lives." Eleanor waved away the praise. "I just opened my door. Anyone would have done the same." Mark, who had come back inside, shook his head. "No, ma'am. Not everyone would welcome 89 Hells Angels into their home during a tornado." The bikers gathered their belongings from various corners of the house. Some had stashed backpacks in the living room. Others had left jackets draped over kitchen chairs. Eleanor moved among them, helping reunite people with misplaced gloves and helmets. In the kitchen, 3 bikers insisted on washing the dishes they'd used. But Eleanor watched with amusement as tattooed hands carefully scrubbed her china bowls and wiped down countertops. "These are nice dishes," commented a man with a graying beard. "My mother had some similar ones. Sunday best, she called them." "They were my wedding china," Eleanor explained. "Never saw the point in keeping nice things locked away for special occasions. Every day above ground is special enough." The man nodded appreciatively, drying another bowl with care. Outside, engines began starting up, the familiar rumble of motorcycles filling the air. Eleanor felt a strange pang as she realized her unexpected guests would soon be gone. For a few hours, her quiet home had been filled with life and voices. The contrast between that and her usual solitude seemed sharper now. Mark approached her as she stood in the doorway. "Oh, we've taken up enough of your time, Eleanor. We should get back on the road." "You're welcome to stay longer if you need," she offered. "I've got plenty of food." He smiled, the expression softening his weathered face. "That's kind of you, but we need to make up some miles today. Got a rally to reach by tomorrow?" Eleanor nodded, understanding. She stepped outside onto the porch as the bikers mounted their motorcycles. Some waved to her, others called out thanks. A few came up to shake her hand before joining their companions. The purple-haired woman approached, holding out a small folded paper. "It's not much, but it's our chapter's information. If you ever need anything at all, you call that number." Eleanor took the paper, touched by the gesture. "Thank you, dear. You ride safe now." Mark was the last to leave. He stood beside his bike, helmet in hand, looking at Eleanor with genuine respect. "I don't know many people who would have done what you did," he said. "Opening your door to strangers, to people who look like us." Eleanor smiled. "I wasn't raised to judge books by their covers, and I wasn't raised to turn away people in need." "We won't forget this," Mark said. "One day we'll be back to properly thank you." "No thanks needed," Eleanor replied. "Just knowing you're all safe is enough for me." Mark nodded, then reached out and gently squeezed her shoulder. The gesture conveyed what words couldn't: gratitude, respect, and a promise. He put on his helmet, started his motorcycle, and joined the others waiting at the end of the driveway. Eleanor watched as the long line of bikers pulled away from her property, and their engines rumbling in unison. They formed a parade of leather and chrome, heading back to the highway and whatever adventures awaited them. As the last motorcycle disappeared around the bend, Eleanor's farmhouse fell silent once more. She stood on her porch for a long moment, looking at the empty driveway. Then, with a small smile, she turned and went back inside, the sound of her own footsteps echoing in the quiet house. The morning after the tornado brought clear skies and gentle breezes, as if nature was apologizing for its previous fury. Eleanor woke early, as she had done every day for the past 60 years. Her body knew the rhythm of farm life, even though the demands of that life had lessened over time. She made herself a simple breakfast of toast and coffee, then pulled on her gardening gloves. And the storm had wreaked havoc on her flower beds. Many of her prized dahlias lay flattened, and debris was scattered across her vegetable patch. Eleanor sighed, but set to work with the steady patience that had carried her through harder times than a damaged garden. The sun warmed her back as she knelt in the soft earth, pulling weeds and straightening plants that could be saved. Her hands, spotted with age but still strong, worked methodically. Birds sang in the trees, and somewhere in the distance, a tractor hummed. "Good morning, Eleanor." She looked up to see her neighbor, Jim Peterson, waving from the road. He was walking his golden retriever, as he did every morning. "Morning, Jim," she called back, brushing dirt from her knees as she stood. "Just saw you on the news," he said, his voice carrying clearly in the still morning air. "Oi, Channel 7! They're calling you a hero!" Eleanor's brow furrowed in confusion. "What on earth for?" "For taking in all those bikers during the tornado. They're doing a whole segment on it. Better get inside and take a look." Jim continued his walk, his dog trotting happily beside him, leaving Eleanor standing bewildered among her damaged flowers. The news? How would they even know about that? She hurried inside, wiping her hands on her gardening apron. Her television set was old but reliable. She rarely watched it during the day, preferring the company of her radio or the natural sounds from outside. It took a moment for the screen to warm up, showing the familiar face of the Channel 7 morning news anchor. And now, an incredible story of bravery and kindness from right here in our community, the anchor was saying. Yesterday, as a tornado tore through Hamilton County, 89 members of the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club found themselves in the path of the storm. But they also found shelter, thanks to 80-year-old Eleanor Walsh, who opened her doors to these unlikely guests. Eleanor's mouth fell open as she saw footage of her house. Someone must have taken it this morning while she was in the back garden. Then the screen showed images of bikers leaving her property, clearly taken from the road yesterday after the storm. According to witnesses, Mrs. Walsh provided shelter, food, and comfort to the bikers for several hours as the tornado passed through. One neighbor described it as the most unlikely tea party you could imagine. The camera cut to Mark, the leader of the bikers, being interviewed at what looked like a gas station. "She didn't hesitate," he was saying. "Didn't judge us, didn't ask questions, just said come in and be safe. You don't find that kind of kindness much anymore." Eleanor sank into her armchair, her gardening forgotten. The news segment continued, with the reporter speculating about what might have happened if the bikers hadn't found shelter. National Weather Service confirms that the tornado that passed through was an EF3, with winds up to 165 miles per hour. Without Mrs. Walsh's intervention, we could be reporting a very different and tragic story today. They showed more footage of her house, this time with a small graphic that said, "Local Hero" beneath it. When the segment ended, Eleanor turned off the television and sat in silence. The quiet of her house seemed different now, knowing that beyond these walls, people were talking about her. The privacy she had always valued felt suddenly fragile. She made her way to the kitchen and put on a kettle for tea. Through the window, she could see her garden waiting for her return. But for now, she needed to sit and process. The kettle whistled, and she prepared her tea with the careful movements of long habit. Settling at her kitchen table, Eleanor wrapped her weathered hands around the warm mug. She felt proud, yes. She had done the right thing without hesitation. But there was uneasiness too, like a shadow at the edge of her contentment. Eleanor had never sought attention. Her life had been built on quiet acts of kindness that no one noticed or applauded. This public recognition felt like an ill-fitting garment. Not entirely uncomfortable, but not quite right either. Yes, Eleanor sipped her tea and watched a cardinal land on her bird feeder outside the window. She hoped this would all blow over quickly. She hoped her simple act of kindness wouldn't lead to anything she wasn't ready for. At her age, she cherished her peaceful routine and her quiet days. Fame, even local fame, had never been part of her plan. 3 weeks after the tornado, Eleanor's life had settled back into its familiar rhythm. The media frenzy had lasted only a few days, thankfully. A reporter had knocked on her door twice, and she had politely but firmly declined to be interviewed. By the end of the week, some other story had captured the public's attention, and Eleanor was grateful for the return of her anonymity. Her garden had recovered nicely. The damaged plants had been trimmed back, the debris cleared away. Now, once in the warm morning sunshine, she knelt beside her tomato plants, carefully tying the growing vines to their stakes. The soil felt good between her fingers, cool and full of promise. "There you go," she murmured to a particularly robust plant. "You'll give me some fine tomatoes this summer, won't you?" Eleanor had always talked to her plants. It was a habit her late husband used to tease her about, but she believed they responded to the sound of a kind voice. And who was to say they didn't? The garden had always been generous with its harvests. After finishing with the tomatoes, she moved to her herb bed. The basil needed thinning, and the mint was trying to take over as usual. Eleanor worked steadily, pausing occasionally to stretch her back or take a sip from the glass of lemonade she'd brought outside. By midday, the sun was high and hot, and Eleanor headed inside. Her small farmhouse welcomed her with its familiar scents: lavender sachets, old wood, and the lingering aroma of yesterday's baking. She washed her hands at the kitchen sink, watching a pair of goldfinches at the bird feeder outside her window. The afternoon passed peacefully with Eleanor kneading dough for a loaf of sourdough bread. The rhythmic motion was soothing, and she hummed softly as she worked. The kitchen radio played classical music, a Mozart piece that reminded her of Sunday afternoons long ago when her husband would read the newspaper and she would bake for the week ahead. Once the bread was in the oven, Eleanor settled in her favorite chair with a novel she'd been meaning to read. The story was engaging enough, but her attention kept drifting. Despite the return to her normal routine, something had shifted inside her since the day of the storm. The house sometimes felt too quiet, too empty. "Nonsense," she said aloud, startling herself with the sound of her own voice. "You've been alone for 15 years. Nothing's changed." But something had changed. She had shared her space, her bread, her stories with strangers, and for a brief time, her house had been filled with the energy of other people, unlikely guests who had shown her gratitude and respect. The timer chimed, drawing Eleanor back to the present. She checked her bread, finding it perfectly golden and fragrant. As she set it on the counter to cool, she heard the familiar sound of the mail truck pulling up to her box at the end of the driveway. Eleanor wasn't expecting anything important. Her bills were paid, her subscriptions current. Still, the mail was a small daily event she looked forward to. She slipped on her garden shoes and walked down the gravel path to the mailbox. Inside were the usual items: a gardening catalog, a newsletter from her church, a circular from the local grocery store. But there was also an envelope she didn't recognize. The paper was thick and cream-colored, with her name and address written in an elegant hand. There was no return address. Back in her kitchen, Eleanor set aside the other mail and examined the mysterious envelope. It was sealed with red wax, an old-fashioned touch that intrigued her. She carefully broke the seal and removed a single sheet of the same cream-colored paper. The letter inside was brief but heartfelt. "Dear Mrs. Walsh, your kindness during the storm was a light in the darkness for many. In a world where doors are often closed to those who look like us, you opened yours without hesitation. Your courage and compassion will not be forgotten. May your garden always bloom, your bread always rise, and your heart always know the peace you have given to others." With deepest gratitude, the letter was unsigned, but at the bottom of the page was a small, carefully drawn symbol that Eleanor recognized from the patches on the bikers' jackets. The Hells Angels insignia. Eleanor read the letter twice more, then carefully folded it and returned it to its envelope. She placed it on her kitchen table and sat looking at it for a long time, feeling a warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the summer heat or the recently used oven. But the October evening had settled in with a gentle chill, prompting Eleanor to light the fireplace for the first time that season. She sat in her worn armchair, a quilt draped over her knees, and her reading glasses perched on the bridge of her nose. The book in her hands was a mystery novel from the library, and though the story was engaging enough, Eleanor found her mind wandering to the letter she'd received several months ago. Since the day of the tornado, life had mostly returned to normal. Her garden had yielded a bountiful harvest, and her pantry shelves were now lined with jars of preserved vegetables and fruits. The Hells Angels incident had faded from local gossip, replaced by news of the upcoming Harvest Festival and school fundraisers. The fire crackled and popped, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney. Eleanor turned the page, trying to focus on the detective's latest discovery. Outside, the wind rustled through the trees, shaking loose the autumn leaves. The familiar sounds of her country home wrapped around her like a cocoon of comfort. When the knock came at her door, it was so unexpected that Eleanor nearly dropped her book. She glanced at the clock on the mantel. 7:42 p.m. Far too late for casual visitors, especially out here where her nearest neighbor was half a mile down the road. The knock came again, more insistent this time. "Coming, coming," Eleanor called, setting aside her book and glasses. She pushed herself up from her chair, her knees protesting slightly. The quilt fell to the floor, and she stooped to pick it up, folding it neatly before laying it over the arm of the chair. But the third knock sounded as Eleanor approached the door. Caution made her peer through the peephole first. In the porch light, she could see a man, tall, broad-shouldered, and dressed in a leather jacket. Her heartbeat quickened slightly. Something about him seemed vaguely familiar. "Who is it?" she called through the door. "Mrs. Walsh? It's Ben Richards. You helped me and my friends during the tornado back in May. I was hoping I might have a word with you." Eleanor hesitated, her hand on the lock. The tornado had been nearly 5 months ago. Why would one of the bikers come back now? And yet, there had been that letter. Curiosity won out over caution. Eleanor unlocked the door and opened it, though she kept the chain fastened. Through the narrow opening, she studied the man standing on her porch. His face was weathered but kind, with laugh lines around his eyes. His beard was neatly trimmed, and his brown hair was pulled back into a short ponytail. He didn't look threatening, despite his imposing size. "I remember the tornado," Eleanor said, "but I'm afraid I don't recall you specifically. There were so many of you." The man, Ben, nodded understandingly. "I was the one who helped you board up your kitchen window after the worst of the storm passed. You gave me a slice of apple pie." The memory surfaced in Eleanor's mind. A gentle giant of a man carefully hammering plywood over her broken window, refusing to leave until he was sure she'd be safe. She'd insisted on feeding him before he rejoined his group. "I remember now," Eleanor said, closing the door to unfasten the chain before opening it wider. "Please, come in. It's getting cold out there." Ben stepped inside, removing his leather jacket to reveal a simple blue button-up shirt beneath. Eleanor gestured toward the living room. "I was just having some tea by the fire. Would you like some?" "That would be nice, thank you," Ben said, following her into the warmth of the living room. He remained standing until Eleanor motioned for him to take a seat on the sofa. "I'll just be a moment," she said, disappearing into the kitchen. As she prepared a fresh cup of tea, she found herself wondering about this unexpected visit. What could possibly bring one of the Hells Angels back to her doorstep after all this time? When she returned with the tea, Ben accepted the cup gratefully, wrapping his large hands around it. "Mrs. Walsh," he began, "first, I want to thank you again for what you did during the storm. Not many people would have opened their doors to a group like ours." Eleanor waved away his thanks. "Anyone would have done the same." "No," Ben said firmly, "they wouldn't have. That's partly why I'm here." He took a sip of tea, seeming to gather his thoughts. "After the tornado, your story made the news. I saw it while I was passing through Ohio. It took me a while to track you down again." Eleanor settled back in her armchair, watching him curiously. "And why would you want to track me down, Mr. Richards?" "Ben, please," he corrected gently. He set his teacup on the side table and leaned forward, his expression earnest. "Mrs. Walsh, I run a retirement community in Missouri. It's a beautiful place. Gardens, a library, social activities. When I saw your story, I couldn't stop thinking about how you were out here all alone. Eleanor felt her spine stiffen slightly. I manage just fine on my own, thank you. Ben nodded quickly. I'm sure you do. But winter's coming, and this is a lot of house for one person to maintain. I came to make you an offer. A place at River Meadows, my facility. You'd have your own apartment, meals provided, company when you want it, privacy when you don't. Eleanor blinked, completely taken aback by the proposal. This stranger, this biker, wanted her to pack up and move to a retirement home? The very idea was absurd. Mr. Richards, Ben, I appreciate your concern, but this is my home. I've lived here for 47 years. My garden is here. My memories. She gestured around the room at the photographs, the quilt her mother had made, or the chair where her husband used to sit. Ben set his teacup down carefully on the coaster and looked around Eleanor's living room. His eyes lingered on the faded photographs, the handmade doilies on the armrests, and the small collection of ceramic birds on the windowsill. This is a beautiful home you've made for yourself, he said sincerely. I can see why you'd be reluctant to leave it. Eleanor nodded, grateful for his understanding. My Harold and I built this place together, started with just 4 rooms, and added on as we could afford it. She pointed to a photograph on the wall, showing a much younger couple standing proudly in front of a half-finished house. That was the summer of '72. We just put the roof on. Ben stood and walked over to examine the photograph. You two look happy. We were, Eleanor said softly. He's been gone 15 years now, but sometimes I still expect to hear his boots on the porch steps. Returning to his seat, Ben leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. Mrs. Walsh, I understand your attachment to this place, but winters can be harsh out here, and you're quite isolated. At River Meadows, you'd have help right at your fingertips if you needed it. Eleanor sipped her tea, considering his words. What exactly is this place like? This River Meadows? Ben's face brightened. It's on 20 acres of land just outside Jefferson City. There's a main building with apartments ranging from studios to 2 bedrooms. Each has its own kitchen, though there's also a dining hall for those who prefer not to cook. We've got gardens, walking paths, a small library, and a community center where folks gather for games and activities. And how much would all this cost? Eleanor asked practically. I'm not a wealthy woman, Ben. That's another thing, Ben said, reaching into his pocket and pulling out a brochure. He unfolded it and handed it to Eleanor. The Hells Angels have a foundation, most people don't know about it, for community service projects. The guys took a vote, and they want to cover your expenses for the first year. Eleanor's eyes widened in surprise. Why would they do that for me? Because you showed us kindness when others wouldn't, Ben replied simply. You saw past our patches and leather to the people underneath. That meant something to all of us. Eleanor studied the brochure, which showed smiling seniors gardening, reading, and playing cards. It looked pleasant enough, but her heart clenched at the thought of leaving her home. I have my garden here, she said, almost to herself. And my neighbors, though they're not close by, and the church where I've gone for 40 years. Ben nodded sympathetically. I know it's a big decision. I'm not asking for an answer tonight. I'll be in town for a few days. Maybe I could stop by tomorrow and show you more pictures of the place? Answer any questions you might have? Eleanor nodded slowly. I suppose that would be all right. She looked up at him curiously. But why me, Ben? Surely there are plenty of elderly folks who could use this kind of help. Ben was quiet for a moment, seeming to choose his words carefully. When I was a kid, my grandmother lived alone in a place like this. One winter she fell and couldn't reach the phone, by the time anyone found her. He trailed off, then shook his head slightly. I guess I see something of her in you, The same independence, the same spirit. I couldn't help her then, but maybe I can help you now." Eleanor felt touched by his honesty. "I'm sorry about your grandmother." "It was a long time ago," Ben said, standing up. "I should let you get back to your evening. Would it be okay if I came by tomorrow afternoon?" Eleanor rose as well, her mind whirling with thoughts. Leave her home? The very idea seemed impossible. And yet, she couldn't deny that the past winter had been difficult. The pipes had frozen twice, and shoveling the driveway had become increasingly challenging. There were days when she didn't speak to another soul. "Yes," she said finally. "Come tomorrow. I can't promise anything, but I'll listen." Ben smiled, relief evident in his eyes. "That's all I ask, Mrs. Walsh. Thank you for the tea." As Eleanor walked him to the door, she felt a strange mixture of emotions: apprehension at the thought of change, curiosity about this new possibility, and an odd sense of warmth that these rough-looking bikers had thought of her welfare. "Good night, Ben," she said, watching him pull on his jacket. "Good night, Mrs. Walsh. Sleep well." As she closed the door behind him, Eleanor leaned against it, overwhelmed by the choice before her. Stay in the home filled with memories, or venture into something completely new. The morning after Ben's visit, Eleanor awoke to the sound of a car pulling into her gravel driveway. She peered out her bedroom window to see Ben stepping out of a modest blue sedan. He had traded his leather jacket for a flannel shirt, though he still wore jeans and boots. Eleanor quickly dressed and made her way to the kitchen. By the time she had the coffee brewing, there was a gentle knock at the door. "Good morning," Ben said with a smile when she opened it. "I hope I'm not too early. I brought donuts." He held up a white box. Eleanor couldn't help but smile back. "Not at all. The coffee's just about ready." As they sat at her kitchen table, Ben pulled out more photographs of River Meadows. "This is the community garden," he explained, pointing to an image of raised beds filled with vegetables. "Each resident who wants one gets their own plot." Eleanor studied the picture. "It does look nice," she admitted. "But I need to be honest with you, Ben. I'm not sure I'm ready for such a big change." Ben nodded thoughtfully. "I understand. No pressure. Actually, I was wondering if I could help you with some things around the house while I'm here. I noticed your gutters could use clearing." Eleanor looked at him in surprise. "You don't have to do that." "I'd like to," Ben insisted. "It's the least I can do after your kindness during the storm." That afternoon, Eleanor found herself sitting on the porch swing, watching as Ben climbed a ladder and carefully removed leaves and debris from her gutters. The day was pleasant, with a gentle breeze that carried the scent of freshly cut grass from a neighboring farm. "Be careful up there," she called, when the ladder wobbled slightly. Ben grinned down at her. "Don't worry, I've done worse things than clean gutters." Later, as they shared iced tea on the porch, Ben told her about his retirement facility. "I started it 5 years ago," he explained. "Used my savings and got a loan. It wasn't easy at first." "What made you want to start such a place?" Eleanor asked. Ben looked out over her yard, his expression growing distant. "After my grandmother died, I couldn't shake the feeling that it could have been prevented. Then my marriage fell apart, and I needed a fresh start." He shrugged. Helping others seemed like a good way to move forward. Eleanor nodded, understanding the need to find purpose after loss. "And the Hells Angels? How does that fit in?" Ben smiled. "I joined when I was young and angry at the world, but the Brotherhood meant something to me. Still does. The club has changed over the years, and so have I. But we still look out for each other." Over the next few days, Ben became a familiar presence at Eleanor's farm. He fixed the loose boards on her back steps, helped her turn over the soil in her garden for spring planting, and drove her into town for groceries when her ancient pickup truck wouldn't start. During these shared tasks, he told her more about himself, how he'd grown up with a single mother who worked 2 jobs, his troubled teen years, and how he'd found direction in his 30s when he started his business. It wasn't all smooth sailing, he admitted one afternoon as they sorted through a box of garden seeds in her kitchen. I made plenty of mistakes. My marriage didn't last. We wanted different things. She wanted to move to the city. I wanted to build something meaningful in a smaller community. Eleanor considered this as she separated packets of tomato seeds from peppers. Sometimes love isn't enough, she said quietly. Harold and I had our struggles too. We lost a baby in '75, nearly tore us apart with grief. Ben's hands stilled. I'm sorry, he said simply. Eleanor nodded. It was a long time ago, but you learn to carry the pain differently as years pass. It becomes part of you, but not all of you. They worked in companionable silence for a while, the late afternoon sun streaming through the kitchen window, casting long shadows across the wooden floor. Harold would have liked you, Eleanor said suddenly. He appreciated straightforward people who weren't afraid of hard work. Ben looked up, a warmth spreading through his chest at her words. Oh, I wish I could have met him. So do I, Eleanor said softly. She found herself studying Ben's face, the crow's feet around his eyes, the slight gray at his temples, the earnestness in his expression. There was something familiar about him she couldn't quite place. As the sun began to set, casting an orange glow through the kitchen, Eleanor realized she had begun to look forward to Ben's visits. His quiet presence had somehow eased the solitude that had become so familiar to her over the years. Would you stay for dinner? She asked impulsively. Nothing fancy, just soup and cornbread. Ben's face lit up with a genuine smile. I'd like that very much, Mrs. Walsh. Eleanor? She corrected gently. I think after all this time, you can call me Eleanor. The next morning brought clear skies and gentle sunshine perfect for gardening. When Eleanor stood on her back porch, watching as golden light spilled across her property. When Ben's car pulled into the driveway around 10, she was already wearing her wide-brimmed gardening hat and had her pruning shears in hand. Perfect timing, Eleanor called as Ben approached. I was just about to check on my rose bushes. Would you like to join me for a walk around the garden? Ben smiled, looking more relaxed than she'd seen him yet. I'd love that. Eleanor led the way down the worn, stone path that wound through her backyard. The garden wasn't fancy. No elaborate landscaping or exotic plants, but it had a lived-in beauty that spoke of years of careful tending. Harold and I planted these roses the year after we were married, Eleanor said, stopping beside 3 large bushes with deep red blooms. She touched one of the flowers gently. 53 years ago now, everyone said they wouldn't take to the soil here, but Harold was determined. Ben leaned in to smell one of the blooms. They're beautiful. He must have had quite the green thumb. Eleanor chuckled. Not at first. He killed nearly everything the first couple years, but he was stubborn. She looked up at Ben. Kind of like you, I think. They continued along the path to a vegetable garden surrounded by a low stone wall. Harold built this wall, Eleanor explained, running her hand along the rough stones. Took him 3 summers, working evenings after he came home from the factory. He'd collect stones from the creek bed down the road. She pointed toward a distant line of trees. We used to walk down there after dinner sometimes. Well, this whole property was just bare fields when we bought it. Everyone thought we were crazy to build so far out of town. The morning sun warmed their shoulders as they walked. Eleanor stopped here and there to pull a weed or point out a plant with a story behind it. At a gnarled apple tree, she paused. This was our first tree, a wedding gift from my aunt. The apples aren't much for eating anymore, too sour, but they make wonderful pies. She looked up at its twisted branches. Some years were lean, especially in the beginning. One winter we lived mostly on applesauce and potatoes from the root cellar. Ben watched her face as she spoke, noting how her eyes brightened with each memory shared. They reached a small pond at the far edge of the garden, ringed by cattails and wildflowers. A wooden bench sat facing the water. "Fort Harold built this bench for our 25th anniversary," Eleanor said, sitting down and patting the space beside her. "We'd sit here summer evenings and watch the fireflies come out." Ben joined her, feeling the solid wood beneath him. "You two built quite a life together." Eleanor nodded, gazing across the water. "It wasn't always easy. We weathered our share of storms, not just the kind that blow roofs off barns." She smiled faintly. "Lost our first baby before she was born. Had a fire take half the house in '83. Harold got laid off 3 times over the years." She turned to look at Ben directly. "But we faced it all together. That's the secret, I think. Having someone to share both the burdens and the joys." Ben was quiet for a moment. "I never managed that," he admitted. "I always felt like I was fighting my battles alone." Eleanor studied his face. "It's never too late to build connections, Ben." They sat in comfortable silence, watching a pair of mallards glide across the pond's surface. "This place isn't just a house and some land," Eleanor said finally. "It's every argument we had over money, every Christmas morning with too few presents, but enough love, every thunderstorm we watched from the porch. It's where we laughed and cried and grew old together." Ben listened, truly hearing not just her words, but the lifetime of experiences behind them. What he had first seen as a simple farmhouse owned by a kind elderly woman now revealed itself as something far more precious, a sanctuary built by love and perseverance. He looked at Eleanor with new eyes, not as someone who needed his help, but as someone who had lived a full life built on strength and determination he could only hope to match. "Thank you for showing me your garden," Ben said quietly, "and for sharing your stories." Eleanor smiled, patting his hand. "It's nice to have someone listen." After their garden walk, Eleanor and Ben fell into a comfortable routine over the next few days. Ben would arrive in the morning, help with chores around the house, and they'd share lunch together. Their conversations flowed more easily now, the initial awkwardness melting away like morning frost under the sun. One evening, as the sky turned a deep purple outside the kitchen window, Eleanor set 2 steaming mugs of tea on the table. Ben had stayed later than usual, helping her fix a leaky faucet in the bathroom. The repair had taken longer than expected, and now the day was fading into night. "Hope you don't mind the chamomile," Eleanor said, easing into her chair. "It helps me sleep." Ben wrapped his hands around the mug, breathing in the sweet, apple-like scent. "Perfect, actually, thanks." A comfortable silence settled between them as they sipped their tea. The kitchen clock ticked steadily on the wall, marking the peaceful moment. "You know," Ben said after a while, his voice thoughtful, "being here with you reminds me of something I've been trying to do for years." Eleanor raised her eyebrows in question. "Reconnect with my family," he explained, running a finger along the rim of his mug. "My mom's side, specifically." Eleanor nodded encouragingly. "Family is important." "Yeah," Ben said, his gaze drifting to the window. "My mom never talked much about her family. All I know is there was some kind of falling out between her and her brother years ago, before I was born even." The kitchen suddenly seemed very quiet to Eleanor. She took a careful sip of her tea. "I've been trying to track them down," Ben continued. "My uncle, his wife. Mom passed away 5 years ago, and it got me thinking about all those lost connections, all those family members I never knew. Eleanor set her mug down slowly. What was your mother's name, if you don't mind me asking? Sarah, Ben replied. Sarah Mitchell, though she was born a Crawford. Eleanor's hand trembled slightly. Crawford was her married name. She married my dad, Jack Mitchell, against her family's wishes. From what little she'd told me, Ben continued, unaware of Eleanor's reaction. Said her brother was furious about it. They had a huge fight at the wedding, and they never spoke again. Eleanor felt her chest tighten. Jack Mitchell. Her brother's name was Jack. Mom always said her brother was stubborn as an ox, Ben chuckled softly. But I think she was just as stubborn. Never would make the first move to patch things up. Eleanor's mind raced back through decades. Her brother Jack had married a woman named Sarah against their parents' wishes. The wedding had been tense, ending with harsh words exchanged. Eleanor and her husband had tried to mediate, but the damage had been done. Jack and Sarah had moved away shortly after, and communication had slowly dwindled to Christmas cards. Then to nothing at all. She kept one photo of them together, Ben said, pulling out his wallet. He extracted a worn, creased photograph and placed it on the table. This is all I have of them. With unsteady fingers, Eleanor picked up the photo. It showed a young couple at what appeared to be a picnic. The man had Eleanor's same eyes, the same slight tilt of the head when he smiled. Her brother Jack, decades younger than when she'd last seen him. Eleanor had to clear her throat to continue. Did you ever meet your uncle? Ben shook his head. No. By the time I was born, they were completely out of touch. I don't even know if he's still alive. And your father? Eleanor asked softly. Passed away when I was 12, Ben replied. Car accident. Eleanor stared at the photo, memories flooding back. The family picnics at the lake, Jack teaching her to fish, the proud look on his face when he introduced Sarah to the family. Ben, Eleanor said, her voice barely above a whisper. Yet what was your mother's brother's full name? Jackson Crawford, Ben replied. Everyone called him Jack. Eleanor's hand froze on the photograph. The room seemed to tilt slightly. Are you okay, Eleanor? Ben asked, concern etching his features. Eleanor looked up from the photo to study Ben's face. How had she not seen it before? He had Jack's nose, Sarah's chin. Her brother's son was sitting across from her at her kitchen table. Jack Crawford was my brother, Eleanor said, her voice trembling. Sarah was my sister-in-law. Jack Crawford was my brother, Eleanor said, her voice trembling. Sarah was my sister-in-law. The words hung in the air between them. Ben's face went blank with shock, his mouth slightly open, tea forgotten in his hands. What? He finally managed, his voice barely audible. Eleanor's heart hammered against her ribs. Her hands trembled as she placed the photograph carefully on the table, as though it might crumble under her touch. Jackson Crawford. My younger brother, she repeated, each word careful and measured. He married Sarah against our parents' wishes. They thought she was too wild, too modern for our family. Ben set his mug down with a thud, tea sloshing over the rim. He didn't seem to notice. You're saying, he started, then stopped, struggling to process. You're my aunt? My mother's sister-in-law? Eleanor nodded, tears welling in her eyes. The kitchen suddenly felt too small, the air too thick. Decades of separation, of silence, of wondering what had become of her brother's family, all collapsing into this single, overwhelming moment. I never knew what happened to them after they moved away, she said softly. The Christmas cards stopped coming. My letters were returned. Eventually, I stopped trying. Ben ran his hands through his hair, his eyes wide with disbelief. All these years, he whispered. All these years, and I had family out here I never knew about. Eleanor reached across the table, her weathered hand trembling as she placed it over Ben's. I didn't know about you either, Ben. Sarah was expecting when they left, but I never knew if they had the baby, if you were born. Ben stared at her hand, covering his, then back at her face. The family resemblance that had escaped both of them now seemed blindingly obvious. The shape of their eyes, the set of their jaws. Mom never talked about her family, Ben said. Dad died when I was young, and after that she just closed up about the past, said it hurt too much. Eleanor's tears spilled over now, tracking warm paths down her weathered cheeks. Jack was so stubborn, so proud, just like our father. A sudden realization hit Ben, and he pulled out his wallet again, rifling through it until he found another photo. This one was newer, though still worn around the edges. This is my mom, he said, sliding it across the table. From about 10 years ago. Eleanor took the photo with shaking fingers. The woman in the picture was older, with lines around her eyes and silver threading through her dark hair, but unmistakably Sarah. The wild girl who had captivated her brother's heart had grown into a dignified woman with kind eyes. Oh, Sarah, Eleanor whispered to the photograph. I wish we'd had the chance to know each other better. Ben watched her, his own eyes growing damp. She passed away still believing her husband's family wanted nothing to do with her. The weight of those lost years, those missed opportunities, settled heavy between them. Eleanor thought of all the family gatherings where Jack and Sarah's absence had left an empty space. All the times she had wondered where they were, if they were happy. And now here you are, Eleanor said, looking up at Ben with fresh wonder. At my kitchen table, my brother's son. Ben shook his head slowly, still processing. All this time I've been searching for my mother's family, and I end up rescuing you from a tornado without knowing who you were. You didn't rescue me, Eleanor corrected gently. I took you in. And then I came back to help you, Ben said, without knowing you were my aunt. They looked at each other across the kitchen table, strangers and family all at once. The clock ticked steadily on the wall, marking the passage of this extraordinary moment. I have so many questions, Ben finally said, his voice rough with emotion. As do I, Eleanor replied. They sat together in silence, both overwhelmed by the revelation that had changed everything. The chamomile tea grew cold between them, forgotten in the wake of a discovery that had rewritten both their stories in an instant. The kitchen felt smaller as the weight of their shared history settled around them. Ben leaned forward, his fingers laced together on the table, his eyes fixed on Eleanor. What happened between you and my father? He asked, his voice gentle but insistent. Why did the family fall apart? Eleanor took a deep breath. The question was one she had asked herself countless times over the decades. The pain, though dulled by time, still lingered like an old wound that ached when rain was coming. It started with little things, she said. The way it often does in families. She stood and walked to the window, looking out at her garden as if searching for the right words among the flowers. Your father was always headstrong. When he met Sarah, your mother, our parents didn't approve. They thought she was too free-spirited for our conservative family. Eleanor turned back to face Ben. But Jack loved her fiercely. Ben nodded, recognizing the trait. Dad was stubborn that way. The real trouble came after they married, Eleanor continued, returning to her seat. Our father refused to attend the wedding, said if Jack was old enough to marry against his wishes, He was old enough to make his own way in the world. She reached for her cold tea, more for something to hold than to drink. I went to the wedding. It was small but beautiful. Sarah wore wildflowers in her hair. Eleanor's smile was sad but genuine. Our father saw it as betrayal, said I was choosing sides. Ben watched her face closely, seeing the echoes of old pain. Things got worse when your grandfather passed away, Eleanor continued. The will, well, he left nearly everything to me. Jack felt cheated, though I tried to share. Pride is a terrible thing in families, Ben. Your father wouldn't take what he saw as charity. That sounds like him, Ben said softly. Mom always said he had more pride than sense sometimes. Eleanor nodded. The last time I saw them was Christmas, 1979. We argued. Jack said terrible things. I said worse. Her voice caught. I told him not to come back until he could apologize to our mother. He said he never would. And then they just left? Ben asked. Packed up and disappeared, Eleanor confirmed. I heard they moved west. I wrote letters for years. They always came back unopened. Eleanor's hands trembled slightly. After our mother died, I tried again. Thought perhaps without that obstacle. But nothing. It was like they'd vanished. Dad died when I was 12, Ben said. Car accident. Mom never remarried. Eleanor closed her eyes briefly, absorbing the news of her brother's death, even though she'd known it must be so. She never talked about his family, Ben continued. When I asked, she'd just say they weren't part of our lives anymore. I stopped asking eventually. All those years, Eleanor whispered. All those birthdays, Christmases, your graduation, your wedding, all those moments we should have shared. Her eyes glistened with tears. I have a nephew I never knew. Did Jack have other children? Ben shook his head. Just me. And do you have children? She asked hopefully. A daughter, Lily. She's in college now. Ben pulled out his phone and showed Eleanor a picture of a smiling young woman with her father's eyes. Eleanor touched the screen gently. She's beautiful. My grandniece. Silence fell between them, heavy with the weight of all they had missed. I'm sorry, Eleanor finally said. We're so very sorry that pride and stubbornness cost us all those years, that your father died with this rift still between us, that you grew up not knowing you had family who would have loved you. Ben reached across the table and took her hand. I'm here now. Yes, Eleanor said, a smile breaking through her tears. Perhaps that's the gift in all this, that after all this time we found each other. Not too late to build something new from the ashes of what was lost. Ben squeezed her hand, his own eyes damp. I came here thinking I was helping a stranger. I never expected to find family. Perhaps some wounds can heal, Eleanor said softly, even after all this time. Ben nodded, unable to speak. His chest felt tight with emotions he hadn't been prepared to face, grief for the family connections he'd never known, an anger at the stubborn pride that had kept them apart, and an unexpected sense of homecoming in this unfamiliar kitchen with this newly discovered aunt. The morning light streamed through Eleanor's kitchen window, casting long shadows across the wooden table. She sat with her hands wrapped around a mug of tea, watching the steam rise in delicate curls. Outside, the garden waited for her daily attention, but today her mind was too heavy with thoughts to focus on weeding and watering. 3 days had passed since the revelation that Ben was her nephew. 3 days of polite conversations and careful smiles that never quite reached her eyes. The knowledge of their connection hung between them, acknowledged but unexplored. Eleanor took a sip of her tea and winced at the bitterness. She'd let it steep too long, just as she'd let her thoughts brew until they turned dark and murky. She should be overjoyed to have found family after so many years alone. Instead, she felt a knot of apprehension tightening in her chest whenever she thought about truly letting Ben into her life. The sound of tires on gravel announced his arrival. Right on time, as he had been every morning since their discovery. Eleanor rose slowly, her joints protesting after sitting too long, and moved to the window. She watched as Ben climbed out of his truck, a bouquet of wildflowers in one hand, just like the one Sarah had worn in her hair all those years ago. Eleanor's throat tightened. Was it a coincidence, or had he deliberately chosen them to echo that long-ago wedding? Either way, the sight made her heart ache with memories of a younger Jack, laughing with his bride, who before bitterness and pride had stolen his joy. A knock at the door pulled her from her reverie. Eleanor took a deep breath, squared her shoulders, and went to answer it. "Good morning," Ben said with a tentative smile. "Thought you might like these for your kitchen table." He held out the wildflowers, watching her face carefully. "They're lovely," Eleanor said, accepting them with a nod. "Come in. I'll put them in water." She busied herself finding a vase while Ben settled at the kitchen table, just as he had each morning. The routine was becoming familiar. Too familiar, perhaps. It made her uneasy how quickly he was becoming a fixture in her life. "I thought maybe we could look through some old photos today," Ben suggested as she arranged the flowers. "If you have any of my dad when he was young. I don't have many pictures from before I was born." Eleanor's hands stilled. The photo albums were tucked away in her bedroom closet, dusty with disuse. She hadn't opened them in years, afraid of the memories and regrets they contained. "I'm not sure where they are," she lied, avoiding his eyes. "It's been a long time." Ben's disappointment was palpable, but he nodded. "Of course. No rush." Eleanor placed the vase on the table and sat across from him, the wooden surface between them feeling wider than its actual breadth. "How's your garden doing?" Ben asked, changing the subject. "Those tomato plants looking any better?" "They're coming along," Eleanor replied, grateful for the shift to safer territory. They talked of gardening and weather, of Ben's work and the local news. All the while, Eleanor felt herself retreating behind a wall of politeness, unable to bridge the gap between friendly acquaintance and family. After an hour, Ben glanced at his watch. "I should head out. Got a meeting at noon." He hesitated, then added, "I was thinking about what you said yesterday, about not being sure about moving to the retirement community." Eleanor tensed. She'd hoped he'd forgotten her reluctance. "It's a big decision," Ben continued. "No need to rush it, but maybe you'd like to come see the place sometime. No pressure, just to look." The invitation hung in the air between them. Eleanor knew her answer mattered beyond the simple question of a visit. It was about trust, about whether she was willing to let this new connection grow, or if she would keep it pruned and contained. "Perhaps someday," she said finally, on not committing. "I'm not ready yet." Something flickered in Ben's eyes, disappointment, maybe understanding. He nodded and stood. "I'll be back tomorrow, if that's all right," he said. "Of course," Eleanor replied automatically, though part of her wanted to say no, to ask for time alone with her thoughts. At the door, Ben turned back. "You know, my daughter Lily is asking about you. She'd love to meet her great-aunt." The words hit Eleanor like a physical blow. Great-aunt. Family she never knew existed. A young woman who shared her blood but was a complete stranger. "Perhaps someday," she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. Ben studied her face, then nodded once more. "Whenever you're ready." He stepped outside, pausing briefly before adding, "No rush, Eleanor. I understand this is a lot." As his truck pulled away, what Eleanor watched from the window, feeling the distance between them growing despite their newfound connection. She knew Ben sensed her withdrawal, her inability to fully embrace this unexpected family reunion. He was being patient, but she could see the hurt in his eyes each time she deflected his attempts to draw closer. She touched the wildflowers gently. They were beautiful, but they reminded her of all she had lost, all the years wasted. Perhaps that was the problem. She didn't know how to separate the joy of finding Ben from the pain of losing Jack. Eleanor stood at her kitchen sink, washing the dinner dishes as the evening sun cast long shadows across her yard. The wildflowers Ben had brought that morning sat in their vase on the windowsill, a bright splash of color against the fading light outside. But as she scrubbed a stubborn spot on her favorite casserole dish, the phone rang, its shrill tone startling her. She dried her hands on a dish towel and shuffled to the wall-mounted phone. Few people called her these days. "Hello?" she answered. "Eleanor? It's Margaret from down the road." The voice of her neighbor, a woman 10 years her junior, sounded concerned. "I was driving by earlier and noticed you were having trouble with your mailbox. You were wobbling on that step stool, something awful." Eleanor frowned. She'd needed to fix the mailbox flag that morning and hadn't realized anyone had seen her struggling. "I'm just fine, Margaret," she said firmly. "That old stool has a loose leg is all." "Well, I nearly stopped my car right then," Margaret continued. "You could have taken a nasty fall. At our age, you know what the doctor says about hip fractures." Eleanor bristled at the implication. "I appreciate your concern, but I can manage my own affairs." "Of course you can, dear. It's just that, well, living all alone out there, if something were to happen." Margaret's voice trailed off suggestively. "Nothing is going to happen," Eleanor said, more sharply than she intended. The conversation continued with Margaret mentioning her own daughter's insistence that she consider a retirement community, how wonderful it was to have help available, how she'd heard about Eleanor's nephew showing up after all these years. Small-town news traveled fast, Eleanor thought grimly. "I'll be just fine," Eleanor repeated, before saying goodbye and hanging up the phone with a definitive click. But as she returned to her dishes, what Margaret's words echoed in her mind. She had been wobbly on that step stool. Her balance wasn't what it used to be, and the dizzy spell that had come over her had been frightening, if she was honest with herself. She glanced at her reflection in the window above the sink. The fading light was kind, softening the lines on her face. But she couldn't fool herself. 80 years had left their mark. Her hands, plunged back into the warm dishwater, were veined and spotted, the knuckles swollen with the beginnings of arthritis that made gripping things difficult on cold mornings. With a sigh, Eleanor finished the dishes and made her way slowly to her favorite armchair in the living room. Her hip ached more than usual tonight. She lowered herself carefully, mindful of the twinge in her lower back. From her chair, or she could see the wall of family photos. Her wedding day, Jack in his Sunday best, the two of them standing proudly in front of the newly built house. 53 years ago, they'd moved in. 53 years of memories soaked into every floorboard and door frame. But the house was showing its age, too. The roof needed work. The porch steps had begun to rot at the corners. The driveway was cracked and uneven, treacherous when wet or icy. Jack would have fixed those things. Jack would have kept everything in working order. Jack was gone, and she was alone, facing problems that grew more difficult to manage each year. Eleanor reached for her knitting basket, but even that beloved activity had become challenging. Her fingers didn't cooperate like they once had. Last winter, she'd fallen while carrying groceries from the car, since spending an hour on the cold ground before managing to drag herself inside. What if she'd broken something? What if she couldn't reach the phone? Ben's offer suddenly didn't seem so intrusive. A place where she wouldn't have to worry about home repairs or cooking every meal. Where help would be available if she fell. Where she wouldn't be alone if something went wrong. But to leave this house. Eleanor's eyes filled with tears as she looked around the living room. Jack had built the stone fireplace with his own hands. They'd chosen the curtains together. The worn spot on the carpet marked where their old dog had slept for 14 years. How could she leave the only home she'd known as an adult? The garden where she knew every plant? The kitchen where she'd cooked thousands of meals? The bedroom where Jack had taken his last breath? Eleanor wiped her eyes with a tissue. Margaret's concerned voice mingled with Ben's gentle offer in her mind. Maybe he was right. Maybe it was time to consider a change. But the thought of leaving filled her with such dread, such sadness, that she couldn't imagine actually doing it. "Oh, Jack," she whispered to the empty room, "what should I do?" 3 days after Margaret's call, Eleanor heard the familiar rumble of Ben's motorcycle coming up her gravel driveway. She stood at the kitchen window, watching as he parked and removed his helmet. There was something different about his manner today. A determined set to his shoulders, a purposeful stride as he approached the house. Eleanor opened the door before he could knock. "Good morning," she said, forcing a smile despite the uneasiness in her stomach. But Ben's face softened when he saw her. "Morning, Eleanor. I brought you something." He held up a small potted plant with delicate purple flowers. "African violets," Eleanor said, taking the pot from him. "They were my mother's favorite." "I remembered you mentioning that." Ben shifted his weight from one foot to the other. "Can I come in? I'd like to talk to you about something." Eleanor nodded and led him into the living room. The morning light streamed through the windows, illuminating the dust particles floating in the air. She set the violet on the side table and settled into her chair while Ben took a seat on the sofa. "Eleanor," he began, then paused as if choosing his words carefully. "I know these past weeks have been a lot for you to take in. Finding out we're family after all these years. On me showing up with my offer about the retirement home." She nodded but said nothing, her hands folded tightly in her lap. "I want you to know that this is my last visit to talk about the retirement facility," Ben continued. "I've said my piece, and after today I won't pressure you anymore. Whatever you decide, I'll respect it." Eleanor felt a mixture of relief and, surprisingly, disappointment. "I appreciate that, Ben. Before I drop it completely, I'd like to make one last case." Ben leaned forward, his eyes earnest. "The place I'm offering isn't just any retirement home. It's a community. The residents have their own apartments with kitchens where they can cook if they want to. There are gardens you could tend. You'd have privacy and independence, but also help when you need it." Eleanor looked down at her hands, where the arthritis had been particularly painful this morning. "I know leaving this house would be hard," Ben continued. "It holds all your memories with Uncle Jack. But Eleanor, you wouldn't be leaving him behind." He gestured toward the photographs on the wall. "Those memories go with you, wherever you are." A lump formed in Eleanor's throat. "This house is all I have left of him." "No," Ben said gently. "What you have of him is in here." He touched his heart. "The love, the lessons, the life you shared, that's what matters, not the wood and nails of this place." Eleanor hadn't expected such wisdom from the tough-looking biker who'd first appeared on her doorstep. Ben reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded brochure. "Here's some information about Sunset Gardens. The apartments, the services, everything. All I'm asking is that you consider it. Really consider it. He placed the brochure on the coffee table between them. This isn't about giving up your independence, Eleanor. It's about making a choice that could give you more freedom, not less. Freedom from worrying about home repairs, from cooking every meal, from being alone if you fall. Eleanor picked up the brochure, studying the images of bright apartments and smiling seniors. It could be a new beginning, Ben said, his voice soft. For both of us. A chance to be family again after all these years apart. Eleanor felt tears welling in her eyes. I've lived in this house for over 50 years, Ben. It's not easy to think about leaving. I know. Ben reached across and squeezed her hand. I'm not asking for an answer today. Just promise me you'll think about it, really think about it. Talk to Jack about it if that helps. Eleanor looked up, surprised. Ben smiled. I figured you probably still talk to him sometimes. I would. Eleanor nodded, touched by his understanding. I do. Then ask him what he'd want for you. If he'd want you struggling alone or surrounded by people who care about you. Eleanor took a deep breath. I'll think about it, Ben. I promise. And I'll let you know my decision soon. Ben smiled, relief evident in his eyes. That's all I'm asking for. Eleanor sat in her rocking chair by the window, watching as the rain pattered softly against the glass. 3 days had passed since Ben's visit, and his words still echoed in her mind. The brochure for Sunset Gardens lay open on her lap, or the pages slightly worn from how many times she had flipped through them. With a sigh, Eleanor set the brochure aside and reached for the old photo album on the side table. It was bound in faded blue leather, the corners frayed from decades of handling. She opened it carefully, as if it contained fragile treasures, which, in a way, it did. The first photo showed her and Jack on their wedding day. She was 22, her face beaming with joy and hope. Jack stood tall beside her, handsome in his simple suit, his eyes looking at her with such love that even now it made her heart ache. "Oh, Jack," she whispered, running her finger over his face, "what would you tell me to do?" She turned the page. Here they were in front of their new house. This very house, Jack proudly holding the keys, her arm around his waist. They had been so young, or so full of dreams. Page after page, their life together unfolded before her eyes. The garden they had planted together. The kitchen they had renovated themselves. Christmas mornings and summer picnics. Friends who had come and gone. The years passing, visible in the graying of their hair, the deepening of their laugh lines. Eleanor paused at a photo of Jack standing by the fireplace, his arm draped casually over the mantel. It was taken just a year before his heart attack. He looked healthy, happy, his eyes still twinkling with the same mischief she had fallen in love with 50 years earlier. "I miss you every day," she told the photograph. "This house, it's filled with you. How can I leave it?" She closed her eyes, remembering Ben's words. The love, the lessons, the life you shared, that's what matters. Not the wood and nails of this place. Was he right? Would she really be leaving Jack behind if she left this house? Eleanor stood up slowly, her joints protesting the movement. She walked through the rooms of her home, touching the familiar walls, the doorframes Jack had installed, the countertops where she had prepared thousands of meals. Each corner held memories, some joyful, some painful, all precious. In the bedroom, she opened her closet and pulled out a small wooden box from the top shelf. Inside was Jack's pocket watch, the one his father had given him. Eleanor held it in her palm, feeling its weight, remembering how Jack would check it throughout the day. "Time waits for no one, Ellie," he used to say. "We've got to make the most of every minute." Eleanor closed her fingers around the watch. Jack wouldn't want her living in the past. He'd want her to make the most of whatever time she had left. She returned to the living room and picked up the brochure again. The photos showed bright, airy apartments, communal gardens, a library filled with books. There were people gathered around tables, laughing together. Sunset Gardens didn't look like an ending. It looked like another chapter. Eleanor thought about Ben, her nephew, her family. The chance to rebuild what had been broken so many years ago. Perhaps this wasn't just about finding a safer place to live. Perhaps it was about healing old wounds, creating new connections. The next morning, Eleanor called Ben. Her heart pounded as the phone rang once, twice, 3 times before he answered. "Eleanor, is everything okay?" His voice was concerned. "Yes," she said, was surprised at the steadiness in her own voice. "Everything's fine. I've been thinking about your offer." "And?" Ben's tone was careful, neutral. Eleanor took a deep breath. "I'm ready, Ben. I'll come to Sunset Gardens." There was a moment of silence, then Ben's voice, warm and relieved. "You won't regret it, Eleanor, I promise." "I know," she said, and realized she meant it. "It's time for something new." As she hung up the phone, Eleanor felt a strange mixture of sadness and peace wash over her. She looked around at her beloved home, at the life she had built with Jack, and silently said goodbye. But it wasn't really goodbye, she realized. These memories would go with her, tucked safely in her heart. It was time to create new ones. Eleanor stood in her living room, surrounded by cardboard boxes. Some were already sealed with packing tape, labeled in Ben's neat handwriting. Books, kitchen, photos. Others sat open, waiting to be filled. The grandfather clock that had stood in the corner for 40 years was now just a lighter rectangle on the faded wallpaper. "What about these, Eleanor?" Ben held up a stack of crocheted doilies from the side table. Eleanor smiled. "My mother taught me to make those. I suppose they're old-fashioned now." "They're beautiful," Ben said, carefully wrapping them in tissue paper. "We'll find the perfect spot for them in your new place." Eleanor nodded, but her throat felt tight. The house seemed to echo around her, as if it already knew she was leaving. She picked up a crystal vase from the mantel, turning it in her hands. Jack had given it to her on their 25th anniversary. But where would it go now? Would it look right sitting on a windowsill in Sunset Gardens? "You don't have to take everything," Ben said gently, noticing her hesitation. "We can store some things, or you can decide later." "I know." Eleanor placed the vase in a box, nestling it between layers of newspaper. "It's just hard to know what to bring and what to leave behind." Ben knelt beside another box, carefully wrapping picture frames. "Think about what makes you feel at home," he suggested. "The rest is just stuff." Eleanor nodded, grateful for his understanding. They worked together through the afternoon. Ben climbing on chairs to reach high shelves, Eleanor telling stories about special treasures as they packed them away. In the kitchen, Eleanor opened a drawer full of utensils. "I won't need all these," she said, outfingering a slotted spoon. "The apartment has a kitchenette, not a full kitchen." "Take your favorites," Ben said, passing her a smaller box, "the ones that feel right in your hand." Eleanor selected a few pieces, her best wooden spoon, the perfect spatula, the serving fork she'd used for Sunday dinners. Each one carried memories of meals shared, celebrations, ordinary days made special by good food and love. As the day wore on, the house grew emptier. Shelves that had been crowded with books and knickknacks now stood bare. The walls, stripped of pictures, revealed faint outlines where frames had hung for decades. "It's like the house is fading away," Eleanor murmured, standing in the doorway of her bedroom. Ben paused in his packing. "Not fading. Just changing, like everything does." He gave her a gentle smile. "It's like you're doing." Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes. "I never thought I'd leave this place." "I know." Ben put down the box he was holding and came to stand beside her. "It takes courage to make a change like this." They worked in the bedroom last, packing clothes and personal items. Eleanor sat on the edge of the bed, the same bed she'd shared with Jack for nearly 50 years. She smoothed her hand over the quilt. "Jack and I picked this out together," she said softly. "Our first big purchase." Ben nodded. "We'll make sure it fits in your new bedroom," he promised. "It'll be the first thing we set up." As the sun began to set, casting long shadows through the windows, they sealed the last boxes. Ben carried them out to his truck, which was already loaded with the day's work. "That's everything for today," he said. "We're coming back inside. We'll get the furniture next week with the movers." Eleanor stood in the center of her living room, looking around. The space felt different, emptier, yet somehow full of echoes. She could almost hear Jack's laughter, the patter of raindrops on the roof during storms, the creak of the porch swing on summer evenings. But instead of overwhelming sadness, she felt a strange sense of peace stealing over her. These walls had sheltered her through joy and sorrow, through beginnings and endings. They had served their purpose well. Now it was time for something new. "Are you okay?" Ben asked, watching her carefully. Eleanor took a deep breath and nodded. "Yes," she said. "I think I am." She gave one last look around the room, saying a silent goodbye to the house that had been her home for so long. And then she turned to Ben with a smile. "I'm ready?" The morning sun cast long shadows across Eleanor's driveway as Ben loaded the last of her personal items into his truck. Eleanor stood on the porch, clutching her purse with both hands, taking one final look at the farmhouse that had been her home for over 50 years. "Ready?" Ben asked gently, coming to stand beside her. Eleanor nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. She had said her goodbyes to the house yesterday, walking through each room one last time, touching door frames and window sills like old friends. Now it was time to go. Ben offered his arm, and she took it gratefully. The steps seemed steeper today, but his steady presence gave her courage. When they reached the truck, he helped her climb into the passenger seat, but making sure she was comfortable before closing the door. As they pulled away from the house, Eleanor kept her eyes forward. Looking back would be too painful. Instead, she focused on smoothing the wrinkles from her blue dress, the one she'd chosen specially for today. "It's about a 45-minute drive," Ben said, turning onto the main road. "We'll be there before lunch." Eleanor nodded, watching familiar landmarks slip past the window. The Johnson farm with its red barn. The old oak tree where children had hung a tire swing generations ago. The crossroads where the general store had once stood. "I hope I packed enough clothes," she said, more to fill the silence than from any real concern. Ben smiled. "If you need anything else, we can always come back. Or go shopping." The countryside gradually gave way to suburbs, or then to the outskirts of the city. Eleanor felt her heart beating faster. It had been years since she'd been in the city proper, and the traffic and tall buildings made her feel small and out of place. "Sunset Gardens is on a quiet street," Ben assured her, as if reading her thoughts. It has beautiful grounds with gardens and walking paths. I think you'll like it." Eleanor tried to picture it. "Tell me more about the people there." Ben glanced at her. "There are about 60 residents. Most are in their 70s and 80s. Independent folks who just want a simpler living situation. There's a dining room for meals, but each apartment has a small kitchen, too." "And my apartment?" "It's on the second floor, with a view of the garden. 1 bedroom, a living room, bathroom, and kitchenette. I've already moved in some of your furniture. And the bed is made up with your quilt." Eleanor felt a flutter of gratitude. Ben had thought of everything. She watched his profile as he drove, still marveling at the connection they had discovered. Her nephew. Family she never thought she'd have again. "I'm glad you found me," she said quietly. Ben's hands tightened on the steering wheel. "Me too." They drove in comfortable silence for a while, the city gradually opening up around them. Then Ben turned onto a tree-lined street and slowed the truck. "Here we are," he said. Eleanor looked out at a large brick building surrounded by carefully tended gardens. It wasn't as institutional as she had feared. With its wide front porch and rocking chairs, it looked almost homelike. Ben parked in the visitor's lot and came around to help her out. "Take your time," he said, on offering his arm again. Eleanor stood for a moment, breathing in the scent of freshly cut grass and roses. A small fountain burbled near the entrance, and birds sang in the maple trees that shaded the walkway. It was peaceful here, she had to admit. "Mrs. Williams will show you to your apartment," Ben explained as they approached the entrance. "She's the director. She's expecting us." The front doors slid open automatically, and they stepped into a bright lobby with comfortable seating areas and large windows. A woman with silver hair and a warm smile came forward to greet them. "You must be Eleanor," she said, extending her hand. "I'm Janet Williams. We're so happy to have you joining our community." Eleanor shook her hand, surprised by the genuine welcome in the woman's eyes. "Ben has told us all about you," Janet continued. "Norse saving all those bikers during the tornado? What an amazing story." Eleanor felt herself blushing. "I just did what anyone would do." A small group of residents had gathered nearby, watching with interest. Janet beckoned them over. "Eleanor, I'd like you to meet some of your new neighbors. This is Martha, George, and Alice." The introductions continued, each person greeting Eleanor with smiles and handshakes. They asked questions about her farmhouse, expressed admiration for her courage during the storm, and assured her she would love living at Sunset Gardens. Eleanor felt her nervousness beginning to fade. These people seemed kind and genuine. Perhaps she could find a place among them after all. "Shall we go see your apartment now?" Janet asked. Eleanor nodded, taking a deep breath. She glanced at Ben, who gave her an encouraging smile. "I'm ready," she said, stepping forward into her new life. Janet unlocked the door to apartment 214 and stepped aside, allowing Eleanor to enter first. The afternoon sunlight streamed through gauzy curtains, illuminating a cozy living space that looked both familiar and new. "Oh my," Eleanor whispered, her hand flying to her chest. Her favorite armchair sat by the window, positioned just right for reading. The small dining table from her kitchen stood in the corner, already set with her blue-flowered plates. Pictures of her late husband and their life together hung on the walls, carefully arranged to create a gallery of memories. "Ben brought these over yesterday," Janet explained. "He wanted to make sure it felt like home right away." Eleanor turned to her nephew, eyes glistening. "Wars, you did all this?" Ben shrugged, a slight flush coloring his cheeks. "I just wanted it to be comfortable for you." Eleanor moved slowly through the apartment, trailing her fingers over familiar surfaces. Her crocheted throw blanket draped across the sofa. The antique lamp that had belonged to her mother. The bookshelf filled with her favorite novels. The bedroom held her four-poster bed, made up with her wedding quilt. On the nightstand stood the photograph of her husband on their 35th anniversary. "The bathroom has grab bars," Janet pointed out, "and there's an emergency call button in every room, just in case." Eleanor nodded, taking it all in. It wasn't her farmhouse with its creaky floors and drafty windows, but it had potential. Perhaps, in time, it could become home. "What do you think?" Ben asked anxiously. Eleanor took a deep breath. "I think I'm going to be just fine here." After Ben and Janet left, promising to return for dinner, Eleanor sat in her armchair by the window. Below, residents walked along garden paths or chatted on benches. An elderly man pushed a woman in a wheelchair, stopping to show her a flowering bush. A group of ladies sat at a patio table, cards spread before them. A life. People living their days with purpose and companionship. Could she find her place among them? A soft knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. Eleanor rose and opened it to find a small woman with bright eyes and silver hair pulled back in a neat bun. "Hello there. I'm Marge from across the hall. Thought I'd come welcome you properly." She held out a small potted plant. "African violet. They're easy to care for and bloom nearly year-round." Eleanor accepted the gift with a smile. "That's very kind of you. I'm Eleanor. Would you like to come in for a moment?" Marge entered with a spryness that belied her age. "Lovely place you've got here. I've been at Sunset Gardens for 3 years now. Best decision I ever made after my Arthur passed." Eleanor set the violet on the windowsill. "Were you nervous when you first moved in?" "Terrified," Marge confessed with a laugh. "Left the house I'd lived in for 40 years. But you know what? I haven't regretted it one day. The friendships here—" She patted Eleanor's arm. "That's what makes it home." Before Marge left, she invited Eleanor to join her for the afternoon social in the common room. "Nothing fancy, just coffee and cookies and folks chatting. A good way to meet people." Eleanor hesitated, then nodded. "I'd like that." At the social, Marge introduced Eleanor to a circle of residents who welcomed her warmly. There was Howard, a retired English professor who recommended books, Beatrice, who organized the weekly bingo games, and Thomas, who tended the community vegetable garden and was always looking for helpers. "We heard about your adventure with the bikers," Beatrice said, eyes twinkling. "You must tell us the whole story sometime." Eleanor found herself smiling. It wasn't as dramatic as the news made it sound. "Still," Thomas said, "not everyone would open their door to a bunch of Hell's Angels. Shows character." By dinner time, Eleanor had received 3 invitations to join different activities: the book club, the gardening committee, and the Sunday hymn singing. Born in the dining room, Marge waved her over to a table by the windows. "Saved you a seat," she called. Eleanor sat down, greeted by familiar faces from the afternoon social. The conversation flowed easily. Weather, gardens, grandchildren, local news. Someone asked about her farmhouse, and Eleanor found herself describing the view from her porch without the usual pang of loss. As she enjoyed a surprisingly good pot roast dinner, Eleanor looked around the table at these new acquaintances. Perhaps future friends. They were different from her old life, yet there was something comforting in their presence, in the shared understanding of what it meant to grow older, to leave behind one chapter and begin another. Marge leaned over, voice lowered conspiratorially. "Thursday night is ice cream Sunday night. You're worth staying up past bedtime for." Eleanor laughed, a genuine sound that surprised her. Looking around the warm, buzzing dining room, at faces that had been strangers just hours ago but now held the promise of connection, she felt something shift inside her. A small, hopeful feeling that perhaps this place could become more than just somewhere to live. It could become home. Ben watched from the doorway of the recreation room as Eleanor leaned forward in her chair, focused intently on the bingo card in front of her. 3 days at Sunset Gardens, and already she was joining activities, making acquaintances. A gentle smile crossed his face when she dabbed her marker on a number, then raised her hand with excitement. "That's 2 lines for Eleanor," Beatrice announced to the room, and several residents clapped politely. For the smile faded from Ben's face as he turned away, walking down the hallway toward the administrative offices. His footsteps echoed against the polished floor, matching the hollow feeling in his chest. "She's doing well," he muttered to himself. "That's what matters." In his office, Ben sank into his chair and stared at the photograph on his desk. His mother, years ago, before illness took her. Would she approve of what he'd done? Convincing Eleanor to leave behind decades of memories, the home she'd shared with her husband? He picked up the framed photo, his thumb tracing the edge. "I found her, Mom. Your aunt. Just like I promised." The words felt both right and wrong in his mouth. He had found her, by complete coincidence, but then he'd disrupted her life. The guilt of it sat heavy in his stomach. A knock on his door interrupted his thoughts. Maria, the facility's head nurse, poked her head in. "How's our newest resident doing?" she asked, stepping inside and closing the door behind her. Ben set the photograph down. "Seems to be adjusting well. She's at bingo with Beatrice's group." "And how are you doing?" Maria settled into the chair across from his desk, her experienced eyes studying him carefully. "Me? I'm fine." The answer came too quickly, too automatically. Maria raised an eyebrow. "Really? Because you look like someone carrying the weight of the world." Ben leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking beneath him. He respected Maria. She'd been at Sunset Gardens longer than he had, knew the residents better than anyone. Maybe that's why the truth slipped out. "I keep wondering if I did the right thing," he admitted, pushing her to move here. Maria folded her hands in her lap. "Did you push her? Or did you offer her an option she needed?" "Both, maybe." Ben stood and walked to the window. Outside, residents strolled along garden paths, some with walkers, others with companions. "You should have seen her farmhouse. It was her whole life, her independence." "Independence isn't much comfort when you fall and can't reach the phone," Maria said softly, "or when the furnace breaks in winter." Ben nodded, knowing she was right. He'd seen the worn steps, the loose railing, the countless hazards that threatened Eleanor's safety. Still, the doubt lingered. "It's more than that," he said, turning to face Maria. "I've spent years running facilities like this, telling myself I'm helping people, but with Eleanor—" He paused, searching for words. "It's personal. She's family. My family that I never knew existed until a few months ago." Maria's expression softened with understanding. "And that changes things. Everything." Ben sank back into his chair. "I want to make up for lost time, for the years my father cut ties with his sister. But I also pushed her out of her home, away from everything familiar. Some days I think I'm helping her, and other days—" "You feel like you've taken something precious from her," Maria finished. Ben nodded, relief washing through him at being understood. "Exactly. I look at her trying to adjust, making the best of things, and I feel proud of her strength. Then I remember her face when she locked her front door for the last time, and I feel like the worst person in the world." Maria was quiet for a moment, considering his words. "Transitions are hard, Ben, for everyone involved. But what's the alternative? Leave her alone in a house becoming more dangerous by the day? What would happen the first time she fell? Or when winter came and she couldn't clear her walkway? I know you're right, Ben said. Logically, I know that. But emotionally, you've taken on responsibility for her happiness, which is a burden no one can carry for another person, Maria said gently. Give her time. Give yourself time too. Ben looked up, meeting Mariah's gaze. I just want to do right by her. After everything she's been through, after how we found each other, I can't mess this up. You won't, Maria assured him, rising from her chair. Just remember, Joe, she made her own choice to come here. Honor that by trusting her to find her way. As Maria left, Ben turned back to the window, watching as the bingo players began filing out of the recreation room. Eleanor walked arm in arm with Marge, laughing at something the other woman said. For a brief moment, the weight in Ben's chest lightened. Maybe Maria was right. Maybe he needed to give Eleanor and himself time to adjust to this new chapter in both their lives. Eleanor sat in the common room of Sunset Gardens, a ball of yarn in her lap and knitting needles clicking softly in her hands. The morning sun streamed through the large windows, bathing the room in a warm glow. She was adjusting to her new life, finding comfort in small routines and familiar activities. That's looking lovely, said Martha. There's an 87-year-old woman who had taken Eleanor under her wing since her arrival. Who's the scarf for? Eleanor smiled, running her fingers over the soft blue yarn. My nephew, Ben. Winter will be here before we know it. The word nephew still felt new on her tongue, a treasure she was getting used to having. After decades of believing she had no family left, discovering Ben had been nothing short of miraculous. The peaceful morning rhythm was interrupted by a commotion at the front entrance. Eleanor glanced up, her needles pausing mid-stitch. The receptionist's voice carried down the hallway, sounding flustered. I'm not sure if... Well, I suppose if you're friends of hers... Heavy footsteps approached, and Eleanor's heart quickened. She set her knitting aside just as they appeared in the doorway. 3 large men in leather jackets, their arms full of flowers and packages. Behind them stood several more, filling the hallway with their presence. Eleanor! The lead man's face broke into a wide grin. It was Mark, the first biker who had approached her door during the tornado. Found you at last! The common room fell silent. Martha's mouth hung open slightly, and the other residents stared with a mixture of curiosity and alarm. Eleanor rose to her feet, her face lighting up with surprise and joy. My goodness, what are you all doing here? Mark stepped forward, holding out a bouquet of colorful wildflowers. We've been looking for you ever since we heard you moved. Took us a while to track you down. A second biker, whose gray beard reached his chest, set a large gift basket on the coffee table. Couldn't let you think we'd forgotten you, could we? Not after what you did for us. You saved our hides that day, added the third, a woman with silver streaks in her dark hair and arms covered in tattoos. We don't forget something like that. Eleanor accepted the flowers, her hands trembling slightly. Oh, this is too much. I only did what anyone would do. Mark laughed, the sound warm and genuine. No, ma'am. Not anyone would open their door to 89 Hells Angels in the middle of a tornado. That takes a special kind of heart. The other residents were whispering now, watching the scene unfold with growing interest. The facility director appeared in the doorway, looking concerned until Eleanor gave him a reassuring nod. Please, sit down, Eleanor gestured to the vacant chairs around her. Let me introduce you to my friends here. The bikers settled in, their large frames making the furniture seem smaller. One by one, they introduced themselves to the residents, who gradually moved closer, drawn by curiosity. "We brought you some things," Mark said, nodding toward the gift basket. "Home-baked bread, though I doubt it's as good as yours. Some jam from Debbie's orchard. Books we thought you might enjoy." Eleanor unwrapped the basket, touched by the thoughtful items inside. "You remembered I like to read mysteries?" "You told us that night," the woman biker said, "while we waited out the storm. You said books were like old friends that never left you." A lump formed in Eleanor's throat. These people, whom she'd known for less than 24 hours during a crisis, had remembered such small details about her. Martha leaned in, her initial wariness replaced with interest. "Were you really caught in that big tornado last spring? The one they talked about on the news?" "Sure were," Mark replied. "Would have been goners if Eleanor hadn't taken us in." Soon, the common room was filled with animated conversation as the bikers retold the story of the tornado and their night in Eleanor's farmhouse. The other residents listened, rapt, occasionally glancing at Eleanor with new respect. "We've been wondering," Mark said, turning back to Eleanor after the story concluded, "if you'd come to our club gathering next Sunday. Nothing wild, just a barbecue. A lot of the guys from that day want to see you again. Or thank you properly." "Me." Eleanor placed a hand on her chest. "I don't know if I should." "We'd make sure you get there and back safely," the woman biker assured her. "You're family to us now, Eleanor. After what you did, you've got hundreds of people who consider you one of our own." Eleanor looked around at their sincere faces, then at her fellow residents who were watching with encouraging smiles. The sense of belonging, of community extending beyond these walls, washed over her like a warm wave. "I'd be honored," she said finally, her voice steady and sure. "Truly honored." The following Sunday arrived with clear skies and gentle sunshine. Eleanor sat in the passenger seat of Ben's pickup truck, her hands folded neatly over her purse. She wore a light blue dress she had saved for special occasions, tied with a white cardigan to ward off the autumn chill. "Nervous?" Ben asked, glancing at her as they turned onto a long country road. "A little," Eleanor admitted. "It's been a long time since I've been to a big gathering." Ben smiled. "From what you've told me about that night, I think you'll be just fine with these folks." They followed Mark's directions to a large property outside of town. As they approached, Eleanor could see rows of motorcycles gleaming in the sun. A big banner hung between two trees. "Thank you, Eleanor," painted in bold red letters. "My goodness," she whispered, her eyes widening. As Ben parked the truck, people began noticing their arrival. A cheer went up from the crowd, and Mark hurried over to open Eleanor's door. "You came," he said, his face breaking into a wide grin. "Everyone's been waiting to see you." Eleanor stepped out, taking in the scene before her. What she had expected to be a small gathering was a full-blown celebration. Tables laden with food stretched under canopies. Children played on a grassy area, while adults chatted in groups. Music played from speakers, not too loud, just enough to create a festive atmosphere. "There must be hundreds of people here," Eleanor said, amazed. 299 of us, to be exact," Mark replied proudly. "Every biker who heard the story wanted to come thank you personally." He offered his arm, and Eleanor took it, feeling both overwhelmed and touched. As they walked through the crowd, people stopped to introduce themselves. Some had been in her home during the tornado. Others had only heard the story. Y'all treated her with a warmth and respect that brought tears to her eyes. "This is Daisy," Mark said, introducing a young woman with colorful tattoos covering her arms. "She's an artist, does all our custom designs." Daisy reached out and took Eleanor's hands in hers. "My uncle was one of the guys you sheltered that night. He said you offered him your late husband's sweater when he was shivering from the rain." Eleanor nodded, remembering. He reminded me of my Robert. Same kind eyes. That sweater meant the world to him, Daisy said. Changed something in him. He's been sober 6 months now. Before Eleanor could respond, she was whisked away to meet more people. Each had a story, a connection, a word of gratitude. A large man with a gray beard showed her photos of his grandchildren. A couple invited her to their wedding in the spring. A quiet young man told her that the night in her home had given him hope when he needed it most. They settled at a long table for the meal, Eleanor seated in the place of honor. The food was plentiful and homemade. Fried chicken, potato salad, fresh bread that reminded her of her own kitchen. Better than the retirement home food? Ben asked with a wink. Much, Eleanor laughed, feeling lighter than she had in years. After everyone had eaten their fill, Mark stood and tapped a glass for attention. The crowd quieted, all eyes turning toward him. Most of you know the story, he began, of how this amazing lady opened her door to a bunch of rough-looking bikers in the middle of a tornado. No questions asked, no judgment, just pure kindness. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. What you might not know is what that meant to us. Not just the shelter from the storm, but the reminder that there's still good in this world, that people can look past appearances and see the humanity in each other. Eleanor felt a lump forming in her throat as Mark continued. Eleanor, we wanted you here today so you could see what your simple act of kindness rippled out to create. 299 of us are here because your story touched us, reminded us of who we want to be. People began to stand, raising their glasses in a toast to her. Eleanor looked around at the sea of faces, young and old, rough and gentle, all united in their gratitude and respect for her. In that moment, surrounded by the warmth of their presence, your Eleanor felt something she hadn't experienced in a very long time, the joy of belonging to a family much larger than she ever could have imagined. Eleanor sat by the window of her new apartment, a cup of tea warming her hands as she watched birds flutter around the feeder she'd hung last week. The morning sun cast a golden glow across the small garden outside, highlighting the fresh blooms of spring flowers that dotted the carefully maintained landscape. 3 months had passed since she'd moved into the retirement community. 3 months of adjustments, new routines, and unexpected joys. Her apartment wasn't large, but it felt just right. Cozy without being cramped, with enough space for her favorite pieces from home. The rocking chair Robert had made her, the quilt her mother had stitched, and the photographs that tracked a lifetime of memories. Not bad at all, she murmured to herself, taking a sip of tea. When she first arrived, Eleanor had worried she might feel trapped, cut off from the life she'd known. Instead, she'd found freedom. Freedom from worrying about the leaky roof or the temperamental furnace. Freedom from the isolation that had slowly wrapped around her over the years without her noticing. Here, there was always someone to talk to. Mary across the hall shared her love of mystery novels. George from the garden club had taught her how to grow the most vibrant petunias she'd ever seen. And Irene, bless her, had started a weekly baking circle where Eleanor's bread recipes had become legendary. A knock at her door pulled Eleanor from her thoughts. She set down her tea and crossed the room, already smiling because she knew who it would be. "Morning, Aunt Eleanor," Ben said, stepping inside with a small package under his arm. The word aunt still sounded new on his lips, but he said it with growing ease and genuine warmth. "Right on time," she replied, patting his arm. "Coffee's fresh." They settled at her small kitchen table, sunshine streaming through the curtains. Ben looked more relaxed than he had months ago, the tension that had once lived in his shoulders now mostly gone. "How's the new manager working out?" Eleanor asked, pouring him coffee. Ben nodded appreciatively. Better than expected. Gives me more time to focus on expanding the facility. And more time for family, he added with a meaningful smile. Family. The word hung in the air between them, precious and hard-won. For their relationship had grown stronger with each passing week, built on shared stories, quiet conversations, and the gradual healing of old wounds. "I brought something for you," Ben said, sliding the package across the table. Eleanor unwrapped it carefully to find a handsome leather album. Opening it, she gasped softly at the first photograph. Herself surrounded by bikers at the gathering 3 months ago, her face lit with surprise and joy. "Mark helped put it together," Ben explained. "Said they wanted you to have something to remember that day by." Eleanor turned the pages slowly, reliving the afternoon that had felt like a homecoming she never knew she needed. There she was serving cake to a tattooed giant of a man. There, listening intently to a young woman with bright blue hair. There, or laughing as someone taught her to sit on a motorcycle. "I never imagined my life would take such a turn," she said softly, closing the album and running her fingers over its cover. "From that stormy day to now, it feels like someone else's story sometimes." "But it's yours," Ben said, "and I'm grateful to be part of it." Eleanor nodded, blinking back unexpected tears. "I spent so many years alone, thinking that chapter of my life was finished. That family was something I'd lost for good. And now? Now I have more family than I know what to do with," she laughed. "Between you and those bikers who keep showing up with casseroles and repair offers." They chatted as they finished their drinks, discussing plans for the weekend and news from some of the Hells Angels who had become regular visitors. But the easy comfort of their conversation was something Eleanor treasured, a gift she never thought she'd receive at this stage of life. After Ben left for work, Eleanor moved to the window of her apartment. The sun was climbing higher now, promising a beautiful day ahead. She watched a couple walking hand in hand along the garden path, their gray heads close together as they talked. Life had come full circle in ways she couldn't have imagined. From the loneliness of her farmhouse to this place of connection and purpose. From the loss of her brother to the discovery of his son. From a simple act of kindness during a storm to a whole new family of unlikely friends. Ben had been right, she realized. This wasn't an ending, but a beginning, one filled with possibilities she was only just starting to explore. I hope you like this story. Please share what's your favorite part of the story and where in the world you are watching from. Have a wonderful day.